All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started now. You'll have to excuse me a little bit tonight. I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit, so I might have to drink a little bit of water, drink a little bit of tea, and may hear some voice cracks, but we are going to move forward. So good evening, everyone. My name is Kate Raber. Thank you for joining us for the first of two webinars where we're going to recap some of the amazing research that was presented at the International Celiac Disease Symposium this year in Sorrento, Italy. I'm sure you all know I'm the program coordinator of the celiac disease program here at Children's National. We are going to have a Q&A session at the very end tonight, but you will see at the very bottom of your screen a Q&A button. So please do use that, type your question into there, and we will look at that together at the end. So your first question may be, let's see if we want this to move forward. There we go. First question may be, what is ICDS to begin with? Well, ICDS stands for the International Celiac Disease Symposium. It is hosted by the International Society for the Study of Celiac Disease and is held every other year. This year was in beautiful Sorrento, Italy, and it also happened to be the first conference where all of the food was gluten-free. So Dr. Coburn and I were over the moon, and I even ate fried calamari for the first time in 16 years. So the conference location changes every year. The next location will be in Sheffield, England in 2024. In 2026, we'll be headed to Melbourne, Australia. And then finally, we actually voted at this conference on where we would hold the 2028 conference, and Tampere, Finland was chosen. Now, Tampere is about 2 hours north of Helsinki, and is also home to the Tampere Celiac Disease Center, which is a huge powerhouse in celiac research. So these conferences are actually open to the public should you decide that you would like to go. Now let's take a look at our agenda for tonight. And then next week we have 3 more topics as well. So first we'll start with an update on celiac disease patients in Ukraine. Now, a representative from the Ukrainian Celiac Society gave us a presentation at the conference that was really quite moving. We'll then move into COVID-19 and celiac, nutrition and eating problems, and we'll wrap it up with mental health. Now, next week, we'll be tackling patient experience, gluten-free diet knowledge, and adherence, as well as future treatments. So you can use the same link that you used to register for tonight for that webinar as well, December 8th at 7:30 p.m. Now, finally, here on the right-hand side of the screen, this is a picture of us, of the team, minus our dietitian, Lauren Pavone, in front of our group poster, which we will get to talk about tonight. So as you all know, the citizens of Ukraine are now in the 10th month of Russian occupation. A representative named Olya from the Ukrainian Society of Celiac Disease spent 15 minutes talking to us and updating us on the status of celiac disease patients in Ukraine, specifically patients who are children and families. The Ukrainian Society of Celiac Disease is part of the larger Association of European Celiac Societies. So this is a map of Ukraine and the areas that are currently occupied by Russia here on the right in red. Olya explained that before the occupation, there were 2 factories in Ukraine that produced gluten-free food. One factory is now located within this red zone, so it cannot put out any food at the moment. And the other one was here in Odessa, one of the larger cities in Ukraine. However, this year it was destroyed by Russian missiles. So this has made Ukraine essentially a food desert for patients with celiac disease. This has caused high levels of food insecurity with celiac, especially those living in eastern Ukraine under Russian occupation. Many families have reported to have to feed their children gluten because there was no other option. Outside of the occupied zone, all gluten-free food in grocery stores has to now be imported. Now, this is one of these moments where my faith in humanity is restored. Gluten-free food companies started donating products to volunteers in Poland, who then now shuttle the food over the Ukrainian border to the Ukrainian Society of Celiac Disease. Since the start of the war, 24 tons of gluten-free food have been delivered via this route. These gluten-free products are then organized at the Ukrainian Society of Celiac Disease's headquarters and then sent all around Ukraine to families with celiac disease. It's easy enough to send these things to families in unoccupied areas. However, it still leaves a giant population or a large population of people with celiac disease in eastern Ukraine currently under Russian occupation. Volunteers risk their lives to cross over into occupied territory to deliver these products to families still living in this area. Of course, they are not pictured for obvious reasons. So this is a picture of a typical box that is delivered to families with celiac disease in eastern Ukraine. The result is hundreds of children and families who can remain on the gluten-free diet despite the circumstances. These are just some of the children who have been helped by this initiative. In addition to being able to eat safely, many children from Ukraine were invited to a summer camp that was gluten-free in Latvia this year. Kids were not only able to attend a summer camp without fear of getting gluten, but they were also able to just be kids for a little bit before heading back to the realities of war. Kids stayed for a week and then were sent home with bags of gluten-free food. I think this is a really special initiative being facilitated through AOECS, and it reminds me of just how close-knit the celiac community is around the world. If you feel that you want to help, there are a couple of resources that you can donate to. The first is the Celiac Disease Foundation. And if you follow the link there on the screen, it will bring you to a donation form, and CDF will be matching all donations up to $25,000. There's also the Association of European Celiac Societies Emergency Fund. They have this fund that is now currently being used for the crisis in Ukraine. So both of these organizations use the money in 4 ways. Oops, and I don't have those 4 up there. The first is to arrange and deliver gluten-free food to celiac patients remaining in Ukraine. The second is to deliver this gluten-free food to refugees in countries welcoming them. The third is to provide Ukrainian refugees with counseling to help with their trauma recovery and social integration into the hosting countries. And then finally, to provide Ukrainian celiac refugees with advice on the specifics of the gluten-free diet in hosting countries, as well as moral support and gathering events to alleviate some of this stress. So we know that finances are tough right now, and of course, we're not requiring anybody to donate, but we thought it would be nice to at least know our community that there are verified donations options out there in case you wanted to donate. So now we are going to move into many of the abstracts from the conference. Our first section tonight is on COVID-19 and celiac disease. There were 8 abstracts in particular focusing on this that were presented as posters. Now, I'm not going to read through every single one of these, but we're going to hit the important bits as well as the conclusions from all of them. Now, I wrote in a previous newsletter that COVID-19 may be the newest trigger for celiac disease. Many viruses, especially the Epstein-Barr virus, have now been identified as potential triggers for autoimmune diseases. In fact, another poster at the conference identified rotavirus, Epstein-Barr virus, and varicella zoster, which is chickenpox, as some of the potential triggers of celiac disease. Now, this is why vaccination against these diseases is so important, not only to prevent infection in the first place, but to potentially protect against that higher risk of developing autoimmune diseases in the future. Now, the paper I referenced in the newsletter was from Turkey. It showed that there was an increase in celiac disease and type 1 diabetes diagnoses during the COVID-19 pandemic. While we don't have any actual data to back this up, our clinic has certainly seen an increase in referrals, resulting in some pretty long wait periods, excuse me, to get into our clinic, which I'm sure many of you have noticed. But this is not something only seen in our clinic. There were Swedish researchers who tested patients for COVID-19 antibodies to see if there was an association with tissue transglutaminase antibodies in children screened for celiac disease during the 3rd peak of the COVID infections in Sweden. They found that there was actually a higher prevalence of 14 to 15-year-olds with both COVID-19 antibodies and TTG positive blood work. So based on this information, it could indicate to us that COVID-19 may accelerate the development of celiac disease in this age group. Now, we know that the COVID-19 vaccine has a decent track record on preventing infection, but it also has an incredible record on reducing severe symptoms, reducing hospitalizations, and reducing the death rate from the virus. Thankfully, most celiac patients view the COVID vaccine positively. One study showed that approximately 25% of celiac disease patients were hesitant to receive the vaccine, but most of these patients only cited a fear of adverse events as their hesitation for getting the vaccine. Only 5% of patients actually completely refused the vaccine. 23% of those hesitant patients, though, denied or based their hesitancy solely on their celiac disease diagnosis. But we know that celiac disease is not immunosuppressive. While celiac disease is an autoimmune disease, it does not depress our immune system. In fact, celiac disease is actually a sign of an overactive immune system. There's no evidence to suggest that patients with celiac disease have any different rates of adverse events from the COVID vaccine than anybody else. So we do highly recommend that all patients who are eligible for the vaccine should get it. Now, speaking, and those patients that did all the other reasons why they cited the hesitancy was because of the quick production. Some were just not afraid of COVID, and others refused or rather questioned the efficacy of the vaccine. Now, speaking of the vaccine, a small study from the Cleveland Clinic showed that serious COVID infections in celiac patients were mitigated by the vaccine. Now, while celiac patients did have higher rates of hospitalization, the risk of that was still mitigated by the vaccine, which holds true for non-celiac patients as well. It should be noted that this Cleveland Clinic study was quite a small study, so we cannot make sweeping generalizations off of it, though we will get to a much larger study later. For me, I had Omicron in December of 2021. I definitely felt like I got hit by a bus and was in bed for about 2 days, but not once did I ever feel like I needed the help of a physician, let alone be hospitalized. Was I miserable? Yes. But was my overall health and life in danger? Absolutely not. So I'm very grateful that my COVID-19 infection was not as bad as some other people that I know. And I attribute a lot of that to getting vaccinated and boosted in a timely manner. But COVID-19 did change a lot about our society outside of just getting sick. One of the silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic was the widespread introduction of telemedicine. We started our telemedicine clinics in April of 2020 and have only just begun in-person visits. This has allowed us to more easily reach some of our patients who live great distances from our locations. Before the pandemic, some patients would face a 2-hour drive just to get to the office. We even had some families renting a hotel room the night before in order to make it on time the next morning. Telemedicine has proven to be extremely popular within our clinic, and because of that, it's definitely here to stay. Many of you may have been asked by us to take part in a multi-center study about your views on telehealth. While the results are still being analyzed from that study, the response from our clinic was overwhelmingly positive. As soon as that paper for that study has been written and published, I'll be sharing it on our monthly newsletter. Now, there was a study too that was presented on a poster on telemedicine. Unsurprisingly, those results were also very positive. Most patients in this study viewed telemedicine visits for follow-up care for their celiac disease as equal value to face-to-face visits. Of course, there are patients who may either prefer inpatient visits or who may require them, but for the vast majority of patients whose celiac disease is well managed, telemedicine is an excellent option. There were also some posters that looked at life outside of the clinical picture of celiac disease. One study actually looked at emotional tolls of the pandemic for celiac patients, specifically surrounding wearing masks. While celiac patients and the regular population didn't differ in their feelings surrounding wearing masks, celiac patients actually did have higher self-esteem while wearing their masks. Now, this brings us to our first kind of interactive feature of our webinar tonight. Go ahead and write in the chat there at the bottom why you think people with celiac disease may have had higher levels of self-esteem while wearing a mask rather than when compared to the general population. So again, you can find that chat section there at the bottom of the screen. So I'll give maybe a minute or so for people to type why they think that self-esteem was higher in patients with celiac disease while wearing a mask during COVID-19. I think for me, at least for someone with celiac disease myself, I find that I did have some, I never thought about it that way, but I felt like I did have some higher levels of self-esteem, maybe because celiac disease is considered a chronic illness. And I think, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know how having celiac disease might affect us. And thankfully, we know that it is not a higher risk. But I think that that may have been something where I knew that I was doing something right, not only to help others, but to ensure myself. Some people may feel isolated or different having celiac disease, and wearing a mask allows one to look and potentially feel like others. Absolutely. I think that, with celiac disease, I talk about this a lot in clinic. Food is a ritual that we have with family members, friends, with the general public. And when we have to put interruptions into that ritual, that starts to play a little bit with some of our mental health. And I think that allowing ourselves to feel like other people, kind of like we're all in this together, and nobody really knows what's going on behind the mask. I think for some people that was uncomfortable, but for a lot of people, I think that also really did boost some of that confidence and self-esteem. Now, sort of on the same note as that previous study, a Portuguese study showed that patients with celiac disease felt that gluten cross-contact measures were useful for mitigating COVID-19 transmission. For me, this was also never something I really thought about, but it makes perfect sense. I kind of tapped into my highway hypnosis that I have when I describe cleaning and ensuring cross contact isn't an issue, to make sure that things that I was touching were staying clean from a COVID perspective. Now, in this study, interestingly, COVID patients with celiac disease felt that their general health declined after a COVID infection. Now, again, this is a really small study, definitely too small for us to make any sort of generalizations about whether or not that's due to celiac. But we do know that even healthy populations have issues with long COVID. And that's just further evidence that we should be, vaccinating ourselves against COVID. For me, I actually got my booster on Monday. Now, some researchers are even considering the fact that long COVID may be classed as an autoimmune disease in and of itself. There is a really excellent article on that topic and the website of one of our partners, the Global Autoimmune Institute. So I highly recommend going over to their website on the COVID-19 section and reading up on it. Generally speaking, though, people with celiac disease have about the same outcomes as the general population when it comes to COVID. This should hopefully come as some relief to you as we're still navigating through a pandemic. Dr. Benjamin Lebwall of Columbia University's Celiac Disease Center presented on research that he and his team collected with patients with celiac disease who also had COVID-19. They studied several populations and scenarios for COVID-19 and celiac disease. After adjusting for various comorbidities, they found that the risk of hospitalization for COVID-19 was not significantly increased in patients with celiac disease, nor was the risk of severe COVID-19 increased. The results were similar when they compared celiac patients to their non-celiac siblings with regard to those outcomes. Among all patients with celiac disease and controls hospitalized with a diagnosis of COVID-19, there was also no significant difference in mortality rates. So essentially, our risk for a serious infection or death as people with celiac disease is the same as the general population, so that really should give us some relief. Now we're going to move into the second section of the night, nutrition and eating problems. Now, a common symptom of celiac disease and often considered to be almost the hallmark of presentation of celiac is poor growth and poor weight gain, often leading to children or adults being undernourished. This is due to the damage to the small intestine where our body absorbs nutrients. This is why we always check vitamin and mineral levels in our patients so that we can make sure everything is looking good. The first study we're looking at, while it was in adults, is still interesting nonetheless. It looked at patients with celiac disease with low ferritin, but who did not have anemia, which is an iron deficiency. Iron is, of course, a core mineral present in our red blood cells that carries oxygen throughout the body. Ferritin, on the other hand, is a protein that stores iron and then releases it whenever the body needs it. The question in this abstract then was what the prevalence and significance of low ferritin levels in celiac disease was who had normal iron. They found that patients with lower ferritin were more often females, had a lower BMI, lower hemoglobin levels, lower iron levels, so they were still within the normal limits, and on their biopsies had a lower villus height crypt ratio, as well as more intraepithelial lymphocytes, or IELs as we call them. Now, IELs are immune cells that are kind of a first line defense for our body's immune system in our small intestine. These are immune, they are also what some people call killer T cells or natural killer T cells, as they kill off invading pathogens or destroy infected tissues. These increased IELs are a very important part of ensuring that the damage to the small intestine is caused by an autoimmune process like celiac disease instead of something else like an allergy or a medication. And so when I talk about villus height and crypt depth ratio, that is what a bit more of a visual here. It's a way of measuring damage to the small intestine. So on the top, you can see this is the villus height. These are those fingers in our small intestine where we absorb all of our nutrients. These black dots are those IELs, those natural killer T cells. And so as this crypt depth underneath these fingers here increases, this villus height decreases. So that means that there's less and less surface area to absorb nutrients from, and therefore means more damage to the small intestine. So essentially, that means that the more and more that this phenomenon happened, the more damage there tended to be to the gut. Now, this did not have any differences in this study between GI and neurological symptoms, health-related quality of life, bone mineral density, liver function, vitamin levels, TTG levels, or any comorbidities. So essentially, this phenomenon is pretty common in women and did not always resolve on a gluten-free diet. So how do we resolve that? Higher iron intake, whether that be through more iron-rich foods or via supplements. But as we know, low vitamin and mineral levels are pretty common in celiac disease. I was really excited to see this study out of Saudi Arabia because the Middle East is one of the areas of the world where it's believed that celiac disease is super underdiagnosed. Now, these researchers compared levels of vitamins and minerals and some proteins that they tested to see which were lower in kids who tested positive for celiac disease. So what they found was that hemoglobin, iron, ferritin, vitamin A, vitamin D, zinc. Let's see, I am not reading this correctly. Where's it going? And then those bottom two that are being currently blocked by my screen, there we go. Selenium and copper were shown as low in patients with positive TTG. So essentially in this case, undiagnosed celiac disease. So what I do want to mention before we move on here, we're going to talk sometimes about healthy controls when we talk in research terms. So healthy controls does not mean that someone with celiac disease is necessarily unhealthy. In the realm of research, healthy doesn't mean what you typically think of. It just means that someone is that we're referring to someone with the disease that's being studied. So you can be perfectly healthy with celiac disease. Now, another study showed that adults have poorer nutritional status than healthy controls when diagnosed with celiac disease. Not that much of a shocker, but that it does improve when on the gluten-free diet when our intestines can heal. We like to kind of boost this nutritional intake by having our patients take a multivitamin for the first year or so of being on the gluten-free diet. We also suggest supplements if the blood work shows that they need it. Now, the last study looking at nutrition in people with celiac disease focused exclusively on adult women. These researchers with Norway performed a nutritional assessment in women with well-treated celiac disease and compared it with the healthy reference group. The concern here was that the nutritional quality of the gluten-free diet is sometimes debated because of the elimination of grains that are important sources of vitamins and minerals. They found that women with celiac disease had a higher proportion of calories from fat and saturated fat, lower protein intake, and lower dietary fiber intake. They also found that women with celiac had lower intake of bread products, of course, gluten-free versions, fruit and milk, but that they also had higher intake levels of cheese and cereals when compared to the general population. Now, this kind of emphasizes the need for this regular nutritional follow-up for patients with celiac disease. But are there any ways to kind of accelerate this increase of nutritional deficits when we're looking at when our gut is healing from celiac disease outside of just letting the gut heal itself? Well, there was one study in Italy that had some thought-provoking results from a study involving probiotics. Now, this was a pretty small study in Italy that wanted to see if a mixture of probiotics would help in clinical and laboratory recovery from celiac disease damage in children. This was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, which is kind of the gold standard, so to speak, of trials. Randomized simply means that participants and whether or not they take the medication are chosen completely randomly. Double-blind means that neither the researcher nor the patient know if they're receiving the medication or the placebo. The answer to this is usually held by a research assistant who's not involved in giving the medication or analyzing the results. And placebo-controlled means that one group is taking a quote-unquote fake medicine, typically a sugar pill, to make sure that the actual medication truly works and that the patient isn't improving just because they think they're taking a real medication. A strict gluten-free diet plus a probiotic mixture or placebo were administered for 12 weeks. Various clinical and laboratory values were measured at the time of enrollment in the study, at 3 months, and then again at 6 months. Now, the only statistically significant finding was that BMI z-scores increased faster in children in the probiotic group. Now, a BMI z-score is a measure of the relative weight adjusted for a child's age and sex. So it can help us in identifying malnutrition or overnutrition. This is a BMI curve, and we're aiming for this green area kind of in the middle here for a healthy weight. Now, the BMI in both groups did increase as time went on, but it was faster in the groups taking probiotics. As for all measures and symptoms, TTG values decreased and vitamin and mineral levels increased, all at approximately the same route in both same rates in both groups. The researchers believe that the accelerated z-score may be a reflection of the effect of gut microbiota composition on restoring the intestinal barrier function, allowing a little bit more intestinal absorption. But don't go out and immediately start buying probiotics. This was a very small study, and they didn't actually even disclose which probiotic strains they used. Now, there is already a lot of debate over the usefulness of probiotics and not much by way of controlled trials showing their effectiveness, but this is certainly thought-provoking, and I do hope to hear some follow-up from this group. So BMI is a really interesting topic in celiac disease. Of course, It's just one measure that we use in a series of many measures to look at the overall health of our patients. Patients with celiac disease are often perceived to be mostly underweight, and many patients, though, can be at a normal weight or even overweight or obese. A joint study from researchers in Michigan and India found that while people with celiac disease tend to have higher rates of low BMI, a significant proportion of patients can also be overweight or even obese. I think this is really important information to be released and made clear because many physicians who may not be up to date on recent celiac research may rely on old celiac information and completely discount the possibility of celiac disease in someone who's overweight or obese. Now, that was a study done in adults, but another study done in children found a similar thing. While they did not reach statistical significance, the research showed that there was a small trend in the rise of prevalence of overweight children with celiac disease after the start of the gluten-free diet. However, the incidence of overweight children with celiac disease was still lower than the incidence of overweight children in the general population. There's a third and final study that looked at overnutrition in Canada, Canadian adults specifically with celiac disease. They actually found that overnutrition was quite frequent in adults with celiac. 59% of study participants had a BMI that was not within the normal limits. 7.5 were undernourished, 26% were overweight, and 25% of people were obese. Now, these numbers don't add up exactly because there are some decimal points that were omitted from the abstract, but you get the picture. Now, 20% of that 7.5% of undernourished population was actually at a moderate or severe risk for malnutrition. But on the flip side, 50% of the obese population, so that's the 25%, reported moderate to significant functional limitations like metabolic issues, trouble performing everyday tasks, mental health concerns, and social concerns. But they didn't find any correlation with age, sex, years since diagnosis, or length of time on the gluten-free diet. Now, this brings up an issue I mentioned earlier, the nutritional content in gluten-free substitute foods. This will vary based on where you are in the world, but in the US, we typically see gluten-free foods as being less nutrient dense than their gluten-containing counterparts. A study from the Celiac Society of Ireland found that, at least in Ireland, the nutrient profiles of gluten-free foods and their gluten-containing counterparts were on average similar. However, there were certain categories where there were large differences, namely bread and crackers. Gluten-free bread had 23% more calories and 39% more saturated fat. Plain gluten-free crackers had 48% more fat than gluten-containing counterparts, and that percentage climbed to 148% more fat when the crackers were flavored. They did find as well that there was a clear increase in the cost of gluten-free staple foods, though. For example, gluten-free oats were 79% more expensive than regular oats. So this may not only have financial implications, but also nutritional implications for patients who have lower income levels. Similarly, a study in India found that gluten-free foods were more expensive than their gluten-containing counterparts, to the tune of about 232% more expensive. Calories were about even in gluten-free and gluten-containing foods, but protein and dietary fiber were significantly lower in gluten-free pastas, flours, and nutrition bars. Gluten-free versions also had higher levels of total and trans fat, as well as sodium in breads, candies, cookies, and snack items. I should note briefly that trans fats are outright banned in the United States, whereas they are only limited in India. So trans fat content is not something to be worrying about for your weekly grocery run. 73% of these products that they surveyed were considered to be ultra-processed. Now, many gluten-free or gluten-containing products are fortified, meaning that extra vitamins and minerals are added to them. It's a bit of a coin toss rather for gluten-free products. Some are fortified, some aren't. The levels and types of vitamins and minerals can also be a toss-up, but the US does have rules about how much of which vitamin and minerals need to be present before you can legally label something like flour as enriched. Researchers from London looked specifically at calcium levels in gluten-free versus wheat-based bread. They found that there is a massive range of calcium levels in gluten-free bread products. On average, white loaves had a lower average calcium content than any of the other loaves. Only 27% of white loaves and white bread rolls were fortified with calcium, contrasted with 100% of white wheat-based bread. This is one of the reasons why we highly recommend whole grain gluten-free loaves, in this case, brown loaves or seeded loaves, as they usually will contain more calcium, but also more fiber. Now, processed foods are certainly okay to have in our diet, but in moderation. Too many processed foods high in sugars and fats can cause health problems later down the line, like type 2 diabetes. You can also develop something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD. We know that patients with celiac disease on the gluten-free diet do have a higher risk of developing NAFLD than the higher population. And we're not exactly sure why. Some researchers have suggested persistent intestinal permeability alterations, as well as contents of the gluten-free diet as potential causes, but we're not entirely sure. Given that packaged gluten-free foods tend to have higher levels of fats and lower levels of fiber and protein, researchers from Italy wanted to see whether a diet based in packaged gluten-free foods could be correlated to the presence of NAFLD in celiac patients. About 30% of participants had evidence of NAFLD. They used a statistical method called binary logistic regression to ensure that any common metabolic risk factors could be excluded from this analysis. So they found that consuming high levels of packaged gluten-free foods significantly increased the risk for developing NAFLD. In particular, increased consumption of processed breads, sweets, and salted convenience foods were associated with higher risk of NAFLD development. At the end of the day, it's about finding balance. Foods are meant to be eaten in moderation. But what about the opposite end of excessive consumption? Now, this brings us to the poster I presented at the conference based on some of our data. I wrote about it in our newsletter, but we are going to discuss it here too. So this probably looks familiar to you. We reviewed responses from our preclinic nutrition and preclinic surveys to assess how many of our patients' families reported picky eating as a concern. Now, half of our families from 2018 to 2022 reported that they would consider their child a picky eater. Now, we expect there to be some level of pickiness in kids. That's just a normal part of growing up. Palates expand as we get older. I could not stand butternut squash as a kid, but now butternut squash soup is a comfort food for me. The problem comes then when picky eating substantially impacts a child's quality of life, nutrition status, growth, and weight gain. So of the 240 records that we looked at, 120 reported that they considered their child to be a picky eater. Again, that's 50% of these responses. So we dug a little bit deeper into these 120 patients and what their parents were telling us. 33% reported some form of micronutrient deficiency. 54% reported elevated psychological distress. 48% of parents reported pressuring their child to eat, which we know is a maladaptive eating behavior. 21% would resort to rewarding their child to eat when they refused food, which we also know is not the best practice to use. 2.5% of parents reported poor appetite as a concern. 6.7% of parents said that their child just was not interested in food. 35.8% of parents said that they were concerned about a lack of variety in their child's diet. And 25% of parents said that their child was afraid of trying new foods. So based on this information, we were able to conclude that 43% of those picky patients needed some form of further investigation into potential feeding or eating disorders. Overall, that translates to 22% of our patients who completed that survey who may have picky eating behaviors outside of the normal picky eating that we see in children. That's a very significant number of children who potentially have this issue. So let's do a little miniature research project here if you can. In the chat, again, at the bottom of the screen, will you say one, if your child is a picky eater, if you would consider them a picky eater? And if you would, do you feel that that affects your child's quality of life? Now think of your child's quality of life rather than your own quality of life. So I'll give you a minute or two to answer if you're able to get to your keyboard. I will go ahead and answer this. I am not a picky eater myself. However, I have my arch nemesis of breakfast foods is eggs. I cannot stand eggs. And I never have liked eggs. And I would honestly say I really would like to like eggs, but it does actually weirdly affect sometimes my quality of life if I am at a hotel or a restaurant and the only gluten-free items on the menu are eggs. And so when we would go on vacation in high school or college, my dad would get so frustrated because he would say, you can't eat the bread and you won't eat the eggs. So what else are we supposed to do? So we do have one parent saying she doesn't consider her child a picky eater. And another one saying yes for picky eating, but not affecting her quality of life. So that's what we would say, hey, that's a normal part of growing up is our palates expand as we get older and we try new foods and start to like them. And our palates will change over time as well. So picky eating is really a heavily under-researched area in the realm of celiac research. A lot of feeding and eating disorder screeners used in various clinics focus on food restriction. But how do you truly measure appropriate levels of restricting food intake when the entire treatment for the disease we treat is food restriction? I really wish we had a good answer for that, but the best I can do for now is say that there are people out there working on that exact issue. And we're also hoping to dig into that issue a little bit deeper through more extensive research. In the meantime, we can still address this type of issue in our clinic. We use a blend of treatments like medication, psychotherapy, and eating plans to work with what we have rather than make every single meal a struggle. Now, this brings us to our last section of the night, mental health. And we're going to start with a couple of studies that actually bridge the gap between nutrition and eating problems and mental health. One study from Columbia University surveyed 50 adults with celiac disease. Overall, patients considered their quality of life good, but about a quarter of the patients also screened positive for clinical depression. Interestingly, a majority of the participants that self-selected to avoid one or more foods in addition to gluten, so that's selecting a food to avoid without having a diagnosed allergy or diagnosed intolerance, they had lower quality of life scores as compared to those who did not. Essentially, this means that if we're restricting our intake of foods for reasons outside of an allergy or something like celiac disease, it decreases our quality of life. Additionally, that depression screener was then given to the patients who self-select foods to avoid, and 77% of those people screened positive for clinical depression. That is extraordinarily high. Now, although the overall quality of life of people was good who did not self-select, this food avoidance questionnaire highlighted some of the specific characteristics and factors that are associated with lower quality of life scores, which then may suggest some maladaptive eating behaviors or disordered eating. And I apologize, some of these charts are going to be a little bit wavy and wonky as I scanned them in here rather than try to recreate them in PowerPoint. Now, disordered eating behaviors were also looked at a study out of the UK. Researchers at the Sheffield Teaching Hospitals, where we're going to be in 2024, used a validated screener called SCOFF, which is an acronym for the questions that are asked. Sick, control, 1 stone, fat, and food. This questionnaire screens for the possible presence of an eating disorder rather than diagnosing it. These researchers surveyed 439 patients with celiac disease, irritable bowel disease, and irritable bowel syndrome, as well as screening with a healthy control group. Based off of the results of these surveys, disordered eating behaviors were more prevalent in patients with GI diseases like celiac, IBD, and IBS. As for the demographics, patients with these disordered eating behaviors were actually younger. The average age was 37 years old compared to 46 in the healthy control group. As for risk factors of these patients, in addition to having a GI disease, these also included recent weight loss as well as the presence of a psychiatric disorder. So thinking along the lines of anxiety and depression. We can actually see from another abstract that patients with celiac disease have more psychiatric disorders than the general population, specifically anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder. We don't know why this is. Is it situational? For example, dealing with hypervigilance or feeling different or deprived? Or is it because of physiological reasons, meaning that celiac disease is causing these disorders on a chemical level within the brain? Or is it a mix of the two? Or is it patient dependent? We really just don't know. But what we can know is that we need to look for these types of things when we're treating patients with celiac disease. There are several quality of life screeners out there, a couple of which were the subject of a lot of our research by our psychologist, Dr. Shana Coburn. The newest one, which has not even been published yet, is developed by Dr. Coburn and is called CD Life, the Celiac Disease Life Inventory of Family Experience. Dr. Coburn and her team set out to create a measure that could be used for children of all ages and was relevant to families across the United States and North America. In the near future, the CD Life could be used for any doctor's offices, research studies to identify people who are struggling, as well as to track their quality of life over time. The CD Life will also be a helpful patient-reported outcome measure, or a PRO, to capture whether new treatments going through FDA trials could improve quality of life. So for scientists working for the FDA who are trying to find treatments for celiac disease, the FDA requires clinical trials include patient-reported outcomes in their studies. In other words, a way of asking the patient how they feel. This would be the first quality of life measure for celiac disease that not only uses FDA guidance, but also encompasses the full pediatric age range from 0 to 18 years old. So this is vital for pediatric celiac disease research trials. If a drug trial were to be approved, a new drug were to be approved in the next, let's say, 5 years or so, let's cross our fingers, we will find out more about that next week. They would not be able to be tested in children without a patient-reported outcome measure. Now, the idea of having children, the actual patients, fill these screeners out is really important. This is highlighted by an abstract from one of our research partners at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. This abstract actually focuses on teenagers. What's really interesting is that the researchers assessed quality of life from both adolescent and parent perspectives and then compared the two. The survey, then they used covered topics like physical, emotional, social, and school functioning. Based on the results, they found that adolescents and their parents significantly had different perspectives in various areas of life. Most notably, what worried about what would happen as a child, getting along with other teens, and perceptions of keeping up with their peers. I find this super interesting for a number of reasons. First, because we definitely see this in our own clinic. Caregiver burden can often be higher than the patient burden. But I also think it's a really good lesson in how resilient our children can be. It feels like sometimes a parent's job can just be to worry, but sometimes letting our kids just figure things out for themselves is the best way to operate in certain situations. So this is a graph here on the right. I snapped a picture of this from the poster in Italy. So it's a little bit blurry, but it shows some of the areas that were looked at. Now, the orange there at the top are the significant areas of concern. So we can see from the chart that teens were marginally more concerned with low energy, missing school for a medical visit, and participating in sports. Parents, on the other hand, were more concerned with their child's ability to get along with others, keep up with others, not wanting to be friends or feeling angry, worrying, keeping up with schoolwork, and getting teased by others. So it seems like kids almost have the upper hand in this study when it comes to some of that quality of life. Now, what's interesting to me is that symptoms, which were missing school due to not feeling well, were not only not statistically significant, but that they started to trend a little more in the direction of important for parents rather than the kids themselves. So the parents were just slightly more concerned about their child not feeling well than the child actually was. Now, on the topic of ongoing symptoms, we don't know why this is, but we do know that ongoing symptoms despite a gluten-free diet are a real thing and they can affect quality of life. The next poster brought this up, but in adults. Even though it's not the population we treat, I think it's really interesting. Dr. Coburn also happens to be part of this study, in addition to other researchers from San Diego State University, the University of San Diego State, and the University of Surrey in the UK. They studied adults with ongoing symptoms despite a self-reported gluten-free diet. They split the participants into 4 groups: little to no symptoms and excellent subjective health, infrequent symptoms and good subjective health, occasional symptoms and fair to poor subjective health, and frequent to constant symptoms and fair to poor subjective health. Subjective health just refers to the patient's perception of how good or bad their health is. Several surveys were sent out to each group. We can take a look at the graph that the researchers made based on the results of this study. Groups 1 and 2, the best with groups with the best overall perceived health and least amount of symptoms, complained of fatigue the most. That seems to be quite the concern for a lot of people. And this was by a long shot. Everything else was just much lower than the rest of, than it was for fatigue. Group 3, the ones here with occasional symptoms, complained most of feeling uncomfortable, not feeling as healthy as others, as well as feeling physical pain. Now, the last group, the ones that had frequent or constant symptoms and fair to poor subjective health, complained most of stomach rumbling, partial bowel movements, and physical pain. Now, interestingly, in this study, there were very few differences in reported gluten-free diet adherence. This could indicate several things. Most notably, what people see gluten-free diet adherence meaning. So, for example, my definition of a gluten-free diet is likely different from another person's who may feel like they need to live in a bubble to stay healthy. These results could also indicate the need for more medical, dietary, and/or pharmaceutical interventions. We know that about 1/3 of the celiac population has what we call celiac IBS. Now, I wrote a newsletter research digest on this a month or 2 ago on the potential causes of this, one of which we think is FODMAPs, but removing FODMAPs from the diet doesn't always work. Now, even more interestingly, in this study, symptom burden did not necessarily translate to better mental health or quality of life. So that may indicate that mental health treatment may be beneficial for celiac patients regardless of what their symptoms look like on a gluten-free diet. Though I personally think that everybody should be seeing a therapist. Ongoing symptoms were also looked at in 2 studies involving dating with celiac diseases. I was really excited to see these because, again, I think this is a really important patient-centered research. This was done by Columbia University. They did 2 studies on this, investigating dating-related behaviors and concerns from patients with celiac. They found that the majority of survey respondents felt that their celiac disease had a moderate to major impact on their dating life. The impact could then result in hesitation towards dating and kissing, decreased quality of life, greater social anxiety, and less adaptive eating behaviors and attitudes. Basically meaning that people may partake in more risky eating behaviors while on dates. So let's take a look at the graphs they made here. All these darkest bars on the left of all of these graphs is the total number. The middle bar is male participants, and the bar on the right is female participants. You can see that almost across the board, people were uncomfortable explaining normal cross-contact and ingredient precautions to waiters in front of their date. This discomfort could lead to certain questions being omitted and leading to eatier risking behaviors, as we see here. In fact, some people actually intentionally ate gluten while on a date because of this. When it came to relationships, not that many people felt that their partner needed to be on a gluten-free diet per se, but they did say that there was still a pretty decent hesitancy to kiss their partner who was not gluten-free. Symptoms also seem to affect intimacy, but much more so in women than in men. Their other study went a little deeper into some of the feelings surrounding these situations. It seems that communication needs are something that is very tough, as well as navigating feelings of sadness. This chart shows some of the responses for the question, what did you feel was the biggest struggle for you while dating with celiac disease? Not surprisingly, dining out was number one. And I would argue that this is number one even if you're not dating. Other things included communicating celiac disease, especially the severity of it, to dates, experiencing negative emotions, kissing, and other things like humiliating symptoms or socializing. The next chart shows some of the answers to the question, do you feel comfortable explaining necessary precautions to waiters in front of your date? If not, why not? Half of the respondents said that sadness, shame, and neglect were common emotions that they dealt with when they read this question. I felt it was interesting that it wasn't necessarily because they were afraid of feeling different. Rather, it was feeling like a fraud for ordering gluten-free. This fear that people won't take you seriously because they think you're just on a fad diet. Irritability, unwanted attention, nervousness, and exasperation were also reported. Finally, participants were asked, does celiac disease change what attributes you're looking for in a partner? If yes, what attributes? Most participants chose understanding, compassionate, and accommodating as their most important attributes. Now, I think this whole study opens a really great conversation between feelings that we see people express online or to family members and friends that and the medical profession, the professionals who treat them. I have this feeling that a lot of medical providers who don't work in a multidisciplinary environment like ours or our research partners don't ever really hear this side of celiac disease and life on the gluten-free diet, and therefore can't treat it or refer to someone who can listen. But despite all of this, fear not. What is the good news? There is good news ahead. One abstract showed that a dedicated celiac program improves quality of care metrics, which then, by association, improves patient care outcomes. This could also improve patient quality of life, patient satisfaction, and even the overall cost of care. This graph was really interesting, and I think it just shows the giant difference between so many of these various aspects of celiac disease care and where you get it. I think it's fascinating that celiac disease centers have way more by way of discussing family member testing, which we know that the number one risk factor for developing celiac disease is having a first-degree family member with it. And this low amount of dietitian referrals was shocking to me. Maybe it was shocking, maybe it wasn't so shocking. Now, we're unique in our program in that I teach the gluten-free diet, and our dietitian, Lauren, focuses more on nutrition in the realm of celiac disease and the gluten-free diet. However, at the majority of these centers, dietitians do the gluten-free diet education. It's almost like in this situation here with the dietitian referral, how it was when I was diagnosed. I was handed my diagnosis, and told to eat gluten-free. But what in the world did that mean? I didn't have a dietitian, and I had to figure it out with my parents. Are people just in these situations being diagnosed and then let out into the world with very little knowledge of the gluten-free diet and then expected to just magically do better? That definitely happens at some places. And this graph seems to show a similar issue. So just by being enrolled in our celiac program, these parameters of quality of life are automatically going to be better than if you weren't enrolled in the program. Another interesting poster about what we can do to make it better came from Germany. And it's along the same lines of something else that we offer, which is summer camp. Researchers from Osnabrück University studied celiac summer camps in Switzerland to look at the psychosocial benefits of celiac camp and its benefits to health-related quality of life. They found that camps resulted in more friendships with other children just like them, and that campers also showed increased identification with their peers. Younger campers, so between 8 and 12 years old, showed a decrease in negative emotions associated with celiac disease. Older campers, around 13 to 16 years old, had decreased levels of illness rejection, so essentially denial after camp, but also showed increased feelings of uncertainty once camp was over. I wonder if that has to do with being in this sort of oasis where you can live in the moment while not worrying about your food, but then having to kind of return to the real world after. Now, there were no significant effects surrounding anxiety or social support. We have a family summer camp that we run annually. We will be sending out information as soon as we hear about our assigned dates for next year. These pictures, it's a summer camp run by Children's National. These pictures on screen are from images from that summer camp. It is super fun, and all of the food is gluten-free. And it has been so amazing to just eat with reckless abandon and know that I am in good hands. And I was not even a camper. And we also, of course, besides the food, have other fun activities like games, arts and crafts, kayaking, fishing, swimming, and rock climbing. Now, speaking of these activities, a study from Columbia University showed that people with celiac disease who had higher levels of physical activity not only had healthier body fat distribution, but they also suffered from less anxiety and depression. Now, these results suggest that an active lifestyle may be associated with both the physical and emotional health of individuals with celiac disease. I know that I certainly feel better after a good Peloton ride. It's almost kind of like this release of emotion. But when all else fails, time heals. A joint study between Comer Children's Hospital and the University of Chicago surveyed patients ages 16 to 25 with celiac disease about their current living conditions and factors that have helped or hindered gluten-free diet adherence. They did not reach statistical significance, but generally the responses trended towards celiac disease patients either feeling neutral or more satisfied with following the gluten-free diet over time. Another study from Finland concluded that despite frequently lacking dietary counseling and inadequate follow-up, overall celiac disease patients diagnosed several decades ago seem to be coping well with their chronic illness. Anecdotally, we see this in our clinic, well, at least over the pediatric span rather than over a span of decades. But I certainly feel it has gotten much, much better over time. And the absolute exponential explosion of gluten-free products has definitely helped too. So for anybody who wants to answer, how do you all feel? How has it been in your family? We're not going to do a poll, so you can just put it in the chat. Has it gotten better with time? And is there anything that you find that's made the diagnosis and transition to the gluten-free diet easier? So I'll give us a minute or so. This is our second to last slide. For me, I was diagnosed in 2007. I will start it out with my experience. I joke with some of our new patients that In 2007, you could have cut out a square of cardboard, put some butter on it and put it on a plate in front of me. And I would have told you that is excellent gluten-free bread. Where did you buy that? Because I'm going to go buy a package of it. And so I feel that I think one of the things that made it easier for me was I stopped feeling so sick. I didn't have to spend vacations in the bathroom anymore. I feel that, again, this explosion of knowledge of the gluten-free diet and of celiac disease in general has made it much easier. I remember maybe about 6 months to a year after I was diagnosed, I was at a restaurant and I asked a waiter if I could, believe it was ranch dressing, if it had any gluten in it. And he asked me if he wanted if he wanted him to bring a spoon out with some ranch dressing on it to see if I would taste it and if it had any gluten in it. So I think that, fortunately, I think most of those days are gone. So that has certainly made it better for me. And I know that some of our patients on here tonight are definitely in the more newly diagnosed realm of things. Let's see. So we have someone saying at first it was quite confusing, but it has definitely gotten better over time. She was diagnosed 1.5 years ago. Her feeling better has made it much easier, and also being open to many new foods. Yeah, that's a big thing, is being open to new foods. And sometimes that makes it really tricky for our pickier kids, because a lot of celiac disease is trial and error in finding products that we like. And it is confusing at first. And there are efforts underway by advocacy groups like Celiac Disease Foundation in particular, to hopefully get us on par and on the same level as Europe, where gluten is as an allergen that's labeled. So along the same lines of when you're reading those ingredient labels and it says, contains wheat, egg, milk, soy, etc. There is sesame is being added starting in 2023 as a major allergen. So there is a push to potentially have gluten listed, though it would probably be a few years down the line. Another one said, we were diagnosed too recently to know if it gets better. Seeing how much happier our child is and the availability of gluten-free substitutes of favorite foods have made it easier. Absolutely. That availability is so key. I struggle to think of things that don't exist in the gluten-free world that either are pre-made or you can't just make yourself. Couple weeks ago, I actually found gluten-free pierogies in the freezer section of Walmart. So that just kind of blew my mind. So I was not able to buy it at that time because I was traveling, but I definitely intend to go back and try those out. All right, so it is a little bit after 8:30 now, so we are going to wrap up tonight. We do have a question here. Was there any discussion of possible correlation between severity of COVID symptoms and development of celiac? Not in any of these studies that we saw. We did see that, I believe in one of these studies that, I believe it was out of Portugal, that patients with celiac disease tended to have more GI related symptoms than the general public did. But from a standpoint of severity of COVID symptoms and development, I don't believe that was measured. If you do have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can email me at celiac@childrensnational.org, or you can email me at craber@childrensnational.org as well. Thanks again for joining us. We are hoping to see you all next week. These will also be, they are recorded and we'll also be posting them on YouTube, hopefully in the coming weeks. So have an excellent night. Hopefully my voice will be back to normal next week, and we will see you then. Have a good night.